Thank you so much, first of all, for your time and willingness to share on this topic, which is trauma. We have a strong feeling that your contribution to this discussion will be very beneficial to practitioners of the Dhamma because in spiritual training we have many blocks, and one of them is trauma, past trauma. Sometimes not even at the level of awareness. There's this nebulous block, insurmountable as if, that we are not even in touch with. So we hope that um, starting this series will really help those individuals to overcome this big hurdle. And we know that you have so much experience as a psychotherapist, as a Dhamma teacher, and of course, as someone who actually went through acute and chronic experience of trauma. So, if anyone, you have so much to give and to help individuals. So, perhaps we could start by the question, which is, when you hear the word trauma, what does it bring up to you? For you?
You did say the word block. It brings that up. Another word is knot. When you tie a rope, create a knot, which is a blockage, it's no longer seamless, it's no longer flowing. When you look at nature, rivers, streams, they flow. Mighty rivers, they flow. But then human beings come and they want to, as they say, maximize on its potential as a natural resource, all these dead words. So we try to even, take that natural environment and build a dam to block it, from which people can extract electricity, etc., mechanical energy, from the turbines that work. That mechanical energy can actually be converted into electricity. That's how most of the eastern United States and Canada first got electricity over 100 years ago. It's a block. Trauma isn't a block like that. Trauma stops you in your tracks. There's nothing good that will come out of trauma if, it's a big if, we just give into it. Most people just give into it, at least for a few decades, as far as my experience goes, to try to understand what's happening. So what we do is we take the strategy of a clam or an oyster. When a pebble or a tiny little grain of sand somehow sneaks in as it's trying to open the actual shell, both shells, so it's trying to sift through the water molecules, nutrients that it's trying to survive by. But sometimes a grain of sand can go in and it's very sharp for its delicate body, it's soft tissued. So it starts to put a film around it, its own saliva, its own lubricating agents, to try to make sense of that, to make its own world livable. So trauma patients, individuals who've suffered trauma, each in their own way have and do come up with a way to survive in the presence of trauma. Now, unfortunately, for the majority of people, so long as they're not getting proper help, therapy, proper counseling, ways to understand what's happening to them, most of the means or methods by which they go about to make that traumatic experience or experiences somewhat tolerable, many of them will resort to toxic means or negative ways of coping with it. For that, fortunately, we do have several fields of different fields of within the therapeutic modalities, plethora of modalities. We have several that address trauma, fortunately, some of which I'm not a big fan of, such as prolonged exposure therapy, PE. Others are very promising, but especially my focus has been on the body as a therapist and as an individual who's gone through physical, psychological, emotional trauma. So, but before I delve into that, we have to acknowledge the fact that trauma itself is a transformative opportunity, an opportunity for transformation waiting to happen. Now, remember the block I mentioned. Remember the stream or flowing river. Or even like in Chinese medicine, meridian, energy channel, or even artery, a vein. You block any of these, you stall life. At the very least, you stall it. Oftentimes, you can suffocate life, which means the person no longer is enjoying life, is no longer enjoying their potential. Now, again, if we leave them in this darkness of unknowns, where they just have to gulp it down, take it, push through it, instead of sitting and understanding it. Some people went the other way, where they went and like venting it out type of a mechanism. Express it. Well, what they've been doing is, it's like a forest that's all of a sudden set ablaze. Somebody has a torch, burns a forest, and then a piece of a portion of that fire, the wind comes and carries it and dumps it into another forest. Now there goes another forest. This is how trauma becomes transgenerational or intergenerational. You have a parent. I'm sorry? Memory. Very good question. Memory. What do you mean by memory? In what context? How do you envision memory? When
trauma happens at a certain point in time, and then what we have is the recollection or the reliving of the traumatic experience, whether somatically, physically, or the pictures, mental imagery, perceptions. Could you please unpack that piece, because it's it can become very nebulous. What is trauma? Is it the experience itself? And the aftermath? Is it the fact that when one goes through trauma, there is no opportunity for expression, for outlet, for sharing and being comforted? The word that comes to mind that really captures it is vulnerability. It has branchings. There you find shame. You find guilt. You find weakness, powerlessness, lack of control.
being overwhelmed by situations or circumstances. Basically, you're like that piece of leaf that's fallen, in a sense, when it was doing, fine, still attached to the branch of the tree. Now it's anywhere it could go. It's like it's up to the breeze, the wind, the birds, the animals. That is how the person usually feels, at least in my experience, at one point or another. Now, you mentioned about trauma. The thing that really is difficult for many people to understand, researchers know this, by the way. They understand this. You have some notable researchers in the field of trauma, and who, they talk about this great length. And but it's an event that has taken place in time and space. At a certain time, it did take place. In many cases, unfortunately, it is continuous. So it's not acute, it's chronic. So there's that factor to consider. The other factor is, when we speak about trauma, many people still assume that it has to do with some major event, or related with wars or the military. It's not. These are factors that do happen, of course, but as a society, we highlight these as, yeah, those were traumatic. Or a car accident, yes. Somebody in your family died while you were driving the car, and now you're dealing with that trauma. Or you yourself went through that accident, or nothing happened to you, but other people were injured or killed while you were at the wheel of the car, driving, causing their death. Well, that's also trauma. And then you have life, these chronic circumstances in society today, where you have constant mongering of fear, constantly placing these huge truckloads of causes for more and more fear, where society today is constantly being bombarded by the worst case scenario. Every day you have a new thing, a new war on something, an enemy. Many of the enemies you don't even know, you can't even pronounce their names, their nature. But you do know one thing: it's terrorizing you. So much so that it is affecting your emotional well-being. Now, this is where the other aspect of your question comes in. What is it? So I mentioned it is an event that has happened. In many cases, it's an acute event. It physically is no longer happening as an event that took place in somewhere in your past. But what has been happening since then? The mind, remember the blocks, the knots that we create? The blood flow of life stops flowing. It is sabotaged by the person, because you don't know how to, especially in many cases, trauma occurs a lot of times with children. And many a time it just goes silent mode. Remember the vulnerability I mentioned. Children that are especially sexually assaulted at a very young age, they didn't know what was going on. They were being told certain things. Their whole narrative about life, which was just building, just budding, new world that was opening up, suddenly it had these new, disturbing, painful, unsafe factors about it. So the individuals that this child was building connections with, family unit, this and that, extended family, blended families, etc., suddenly the same person with whom they had been sitting and eating, that same person is next after dinner, while the child is going to the bathroom, they sneak in behind them, or they go into the bedroom or in a private area, and they're doing things to the child. Now the child is trying to make sense of, they're still building the brain, the narrative about world. What is a safe world? What is it? The family is usually where it starts. School. So it's supposed to be safe. And now some things are happening. So where does that get to be recorded? This is where I would take your question to, as far as memory goes. Because there are these, I'm sure you've heard about fight or flight and freeze, which many people don't know. They just know fight or flight, but there's the freeze part, where the awareness, the way the psychology, the brain itself, that is carrying all this data to you, translating the world to you, emotionally sees that this is too much for you to bear, and it just shuts down. Okay, so you're almost like going into a coma, but you're not. There's a part of you that is very much awake, part of the brain that is very much awake. The body is awake. That's where the trauma gets locked, blocked, knotted. That's why it stays with you throughout life, unless you start looking at trauma in understanding the trauma. What is it? Is it the event? No, it's not the event. Of course, the event was a trigger. And chances are, so long as you're alive, you will encounter situations, perhaps not similar to those situations, but things that trigger. For example, if a person was, let's use examples of soldiers in combat, and they see friends of theirs, comrades, being blown up, or they themselves lose their humanity so much so that they go and kill villagers, rape villagers. Now, after a few months, maybe a year, guess what? Their time's up. So if they're still alive, they go back home. They get shipped back. Okay. That memory didn't go, What are they going to do when they see their own child running around? The same child that they actually raped somewhere in Vietnam. Same age, or they killed an entire family. Now they're actually celebrating birthday somewhere in, I don't know, somewhere in the US. Let's pick Wisconsin, somewhere, good old-fashioned American, environment, family getting together. But he had done certain things that he's totally, utterly ashamed of. That's traumatic. There's guilt. What does he do? Individuals usually will resort to, as I said, some toxic means. Some of the risk factors include drugs, alcohol, getting into certain addictions, letting go, basically, The thing that gets damaged the most is your prefrontal cortex, this part, and which is the executive part of the brain, which says, I'm not going to skip the scene. I'm not going to eject while the trauma is going on. Because what happens is, as I was saying earlier, I don't want to get sidetracked because it's such a vast topic, and I'm glad that we're doing this in a series, because I would like for this to really be applicable, useful for people, because whether we like it or not, majority of the planet today is very much traumatized. With the whole COVID thing 4 years ago happened, 5 years ago now, actually. So everybody's traumatized in one way, not because of one event, though. The triggers. Now, the triggers might be reminiscent of some or one of the factors of the initial event that took place, let's say 27 years ago. I mentioned the example of a car accident. Any moment where the person involved hears a screech of a brake of a car's engine, or the car moving fast, and let's say they had loved ones who were killed, children. This is individuals that I've come to know personally. Their loved ones had gone to get some ice cream on a hot day in Australia, and somebody, I think it was a DUI drunk driver, was just speeding away and killed these children. Not one, not two, but three. So the trauma, the traumatic event took place, let's say 3, 4, 5 years ago, 6 years ago. But every time the person hears a car whizzing by, they're startled. They drop things. It will take time for you to go ahead and get them, snap out of it. Why? Because the prefrontal cortex just went offline. Just like it did when they first heard it or when they first saw it. Why, therefore? What is happening? The mind is recalling certain elements of that remind it of the event. Because the brain works with associations. No neuron actually touches another. It's chemical transference. That's what's happening, but it's happening so fast. So the brain does this wonderful thing where it does connect things, connect the dots, basically, connects the neurons through associations, features, this and that. And relationships is the big one. This is where you can say subconscious mind in Western psychology, or the unconscious, like Jung would say, has a lot to do with the body. Now, if you noticed, I haven't said anything about from the Buddhist perspective, because I'm also trained in Western psychological modalities and a psychotherapist. And that has been my forte, in a sense. I've specialized in trauma because I wanted to help individuals who have, like myself, have gone through trauma, different types of trauma. And I'm glad to say that I've been privileged to work with individuals, diverse age groups, from children from 5 years old all the way to in their mid to late 70s. And it's amazing how when you take out all the other contents, specifics, what you end up seeing is a common theme that runs through every single one of them in relation to vis-a-vis trauma and their response to the trauma, which is key. And that has to do with the silencing of their emotions through the body. So far, I've been trying to describe what trauma is and is viewed as a block, as a knot, etc. But let's look at that as dukkha. In Buddhism, we call it dukkha, suffering. Some people call it stress. I don't like that term for dukkha. Difficult to handle situation. In fact, so difficult that you just want to exit your consciousness, exit your awareness. So you go into passenger mode, automatic pilot mode, where you don't want to remember anything. Like rape victims are, this is common with them because when they've tried to struggle and they can't, or individuals who are caught in the middle of in war zone. I was only 8 years old. We were sitting on a Sunday, August, watching TV. I was sitting right by the balcony. Suddenly, a huge mortar, rocket, is shot into the civilian area, the city I was in. There's not a single tank there. It's not like the front line or anything. In the middle of city, in the middle of Beirut. And there's this huge explosion on this side of my right side. All the shrapnel come shooting inside. It's like sharp pieces of glass, but hot, heavy steel, pieces of shards of steel that cut sharper than a knife, any knife you can imagine. You don't even feel it until after some time has passed. But what do you do in such a situation? Talk about vulnerability. I remember this actually happened years later, where the mind, I was practicing meditation over time, and in my 20s, suddenly, I wasn't waking up with terror because it took about 20 years for me to understand. I was living in the US in the middle of Los Angeles, but I would wake up in the middle of the night thinking that, the bombs, the Israelis are going to drop bombs, or the Syrians are going to drop bombs over us. In the middle of the night, I would wake up like, okay, should we exit the building? It's like, relax. What's happening here? So the brain gets to see reality in a certain way. There's this thing called neuroplasticity. The brain has the capacity to rebuild itself, which is a good news for us. The knot will come off, will be untied, untangled, disentangled with the right information. Is this making sense so far?
Yes.
Okay. So when the triggers happen, do you remember I said the brain, part of the brain goes offline? As a therapist, the job of the therapist, or anyone living with a person who has undergone trauma, is to gently, compassionately bring them back to the body. Fortunately, we have a plethora of, I did mention prolonged exposure, but that's not what we have as therapeutic model to address trauma. that really works, in my opinion. Instead of pushing the person back into the traumatic event. For example, there's in the fields of when you bring in, let's say, body awareness type, mindfulness based practices, which Buddhism is the source, Everybody else is just basically a footnote on what the Buddha taught. I'll get into that as the series goes. But in the field of, if you look at Western therapeutic models currently, somatic experiencing is one, which I'm a big fan of. And Peter Levine is one. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk is another. His book, The Body Keeps the Score, is a wonderful book. Because it allows the person to no longer feel isolated and vulnerable and the trauma untouchable, unfixable, unaddressable. And that's not the case. It's a transformative opportunity. The event was one. In many cases, it was just one event. But we constantly have been re-traumatizing ourselves because you still carry the body. Unfortunately, we don't know how to inhabit the body because the internal environment is completely jumbled up. There's a lot of ignorance there. There's a lack of understanding and discernment. And this is where mindfulness comes in. Mindfulness doesn't come in simply to allow you another point of exit from the traumatic event, nor does it, initially at least, bulldoze you straight back into the trauma for you to understand and gain some insights out of it either. So we do it through subterfuge. There's different ways. If a person has been traumatized at a certain place, let's say I gave the example of a soldier, let's say in Vietnam or Cambodia or somewhere, and then let's say you take them and you bring them back, take them back into that specific jungle, into that village, to help him sort things out or work through his trauma. That's a no-no. That's a no-no. You don't do that. Or even sit down with them or try to record their experiences as they narrate to you the events that took place. They're screaming, their pain, this and that, and then you hand them back the tape and say, listen to it throughout the week, which is what prolonged exposure does. For many people, that re-traumatizes the person. So there is no neuroplasticity, because what you're doing is you're helping them reenact it again and again and again and again. There's no insight. And it's not a muscle that you're building, like becoming like an elephant skin so you don't feel anything, or a rhinoceros skin. That's not how trauma healing begins or even ends. Are you, is this,
Yes,
you have a question?
it sounds like it is not wise to engage the narrative, the story, and the trauma as much, the details, and as you said, reenacting in a way the experience.
Yes.
But what you offered is such a powerful opening in terms of the body.
Yes.
So during the trauma, then the mind shuts down because it's too much, it's too overwhelming, but the body is awake. So the healing, therefore, as you said, takes to the body, takes place through engaging the body. Could you talk more about that?
Yes.
How to engage, how to befriend the body, because the body so lives in fear and it's shut down, it's unconscious. How do we softly befriend the body to allow that metabolism of the trauma? Because in the beginning you also mentioned about transformation. So trauma is there to be transformed.
Yeah. In a session, for example, when I used to work as a therapist, now I'm a bhikkhu and I'm a Buddhist monk, and students do have sometimes questions, and I have I'll do my best to address those. But what I'm doing is that therapist hat is always worn, even as a bald bhikkhu. I can't help it because you know things, you see things, you read the body. And I teach, just like I used to teach my clients, my patients, how to read their bodies. I teach the same to my students. And what do I mean by that? Remember, I mentioned how the body never forgets? The body remembers. Why? Because the body is the tool for the emotions. It's the medium for the emotions to be expressed. It is our gateway to life. When you see a beautiful flower, what do? If it's close to you? You lean in. Even if your hands are tied behind your back and somebody has a rose or a gardenia in hand, what do? You lean in. Why? Because you are trying to touch life through this body. But what about the trauma that little girl had to go through at the age of 5, being perpetrated by a stepdad or something like that, while mom was next door, clueless, oblivious? What was that? The body was still taking in information. Unfortunately, it was deplorable. It was macabre. It was traumatic. The child was vulnerable. In one case, it gets locked up, knotted. Now, whatever has happened to the body or has been locked inside the body, remember I was mentioning about the dam? The rivers get dammed and blocked to extract some energy out of it, to make use of it, basically, maximize its potential. In the case of the trauma, so long as the person is not addressing it properly, it won't be tapped into to become transformative of an opportunity. That's why it's highly, highly recommended that the person does their work. The easiest way is to start with journaling, because many people who have undergone or experienced trauma, heavy traumas, they don't even admit that they've had it, because not because they're blocking it, oftentimes because they're never conscious of it. A few years ago, we've lost Dr. Sarno, Sarno, and he was a medical doctor, orthopedic doctor, expert doctor, and he's helped countless people because he opened the eyes of people as it relates to their backache, neck ache, GI problems, knees, etc. Many people were undergoing surgery after surgery. Their spines were being cracked open, lasered, this and that, injections into the spine to help out with the disc problem, bulging and all that. Of course, there are people who really had the legitimate reasons. As a medical doctor, he would explain this, but it's a minority compared to the majority of people who have these symptoms. But when they do go get the MRI checked, and he would see it, he wouldn't see a cause or a problem there as such, physiological, mechanical, structural problem there for the pain to exist. So he struggled with this for a few decades. He spent a lifetime on researching this. Thousands and thousands upon people he saw. And then he hypothesized, given the symptoms that he was seeing in people, and how by him addressing it through different means other than, going into the spine and invasive and all that, surgery, operations, by talking and understanding, and something was revealed. By the way, he termed it TMS, tension myositis syndrome. And people can research this. He's helped so many people and celebrities and all that. And by simply reading his book, the simple, healing back pain, that's his first book. But I was curious about, what is this mind doing? But it's simply trying to cope. Too much. When too much is being taken in. By the way, I mentioned events, traumatic events. What if you're a person who just does 9 to 5 and you go to a job that you don't like? You have a boss that you don't enjoy, scolds you, this and that, or you're always at the edge of your seat. You don't know when you're going to be fired. So you're always under threat. You get in your car and you're driving back and forth through traffic. You have road rage there, but you can't exhibit it. You can't express it. You come home and your husband or wife is talking about things that you're not interested in. I mean, you just want to zone out. Children are this and that. Responsibility upon responsibility. And then you hear your brother died or your favorite friend. Something happened. And then you go to the funeral and you're unable to allow yourself to cry. And then you go back to your normal life, business as usual. And then a couple of days later, all of a sudden there's this piercing, I don't know, sciatica, back pain, neck ache, severe anxiety you have all of a sudden, knee problems, ankle problems, and the list goes on and on. So you go and you get your body checked and the doctors say, well, we see certain things, but that normal wear and tear sometimes is seen as a physical structural problem. So Dr. Sarno was a big advocate of, well, let's get all the results and let's cancel out any possibility that it is mechanical or structural problem, physiological. Once he completely made sure that those are not the problem, everything's fine there, but the problem is there, the symptoms are there, so he would address the real cause for the symptoms. So by getting the person to have a surgery and fix the knee was simply symptomatic, the symptomatic approach, which is what unfortunately we have been doing in the Western medical arena for a long time. Now, when a person is bringing the attention back to the body is trying to speak to you when it's giving you that backache. When you have TMS, for example, or when suddenly you start heaving because the neighbors are yelling, or because the sirens, the ambulance is going by. Suddenly you're on edge. Your wife says something and you scream at her. Your child comes and says, Daddy, Daddy, and what is it now? Go away. If you're not aware of what happened, that's going to be traumatic now for your child. So we need to practice awareness to bring the attention back to this body, because the body is the key. So this is how I am approaching answering your question. So in a session, I'm just going to give you an example. One time, for example, I was somewhere in Eastern Europe, and a person wanted to speak to me about, their issues they were having with family members, this and that, and then her childhood. And then suddenly she went like, meanwhile, she was complaining that she always has things under control, this and that, but she doesn't know why all of a sudden she has these explosive periods in her day, and she feels embarrassed, she feels out of control, she feels angry at herself, this and that. But she's very soft-spoken. But given the answer, open-ended questions I would ask, this and that, it got to a point where a few times I said, I saw her do this, and I would stop. So this is one of the ways that I would do that. Like for me, I'm very curious. I used to be, and I still am, a curious therapist, curious teacher. Your body, I'm reading it like a book. When you lean in, lean back when I'm asking something. It's your body saying so much. Your body didn't need you to touch this place. It didn't call for anything. But I was asking you something. All of a sudden you went like this, and you actually held your breath. And so I immediately asked her, and I was asking something. I was going to go somewhere else, but I noticed something happen in the body. That's a golden opportunity. The body is trying to speak to me. The trauma is trying to speak to me. It's saying, please release me. It's trying to disentangle itself. Because there's a window now. The internal environment is getting the possibility for fresh air coming in. So the body is trying to give you clues. How was I going to see that if I was mindless, not paying attention? So my job then is to teach the client, the patient, the student, to become more aware of their body. Perhaps that might be too much, but I would just then turn the camera, for some people, I would have them turn the camera of observation. We call it sati in Buddhism. Sati. Satipatthana is the sutta, the discourse from where we get the proper mindfulness structure that everybody copied. Everybody copied in the world, especially in the field of psychology. Anybody who talks about awareness, self-awareness, sense awareness, established observing ego, all that comes from mindfulness 2,600 years ago from the Buddha himself. He was the first one who actually identified physical and mental illness. He calls it. So, the person doing this, I remember I just said, what's happening? She's like, what? I said, why is your hand there? What are you trying to do? What is your... Actually, I didn't say, what are you trying to do? Because that's very accusatory. What is your body trying to tell me? I asked something like that. She's like, what is... I said, look where your hand is. She was not aware. She was not aware. Other times, whether it was her or somebody else, I would notice they would pull back and hold the breath. Or it becomes shallow, or there's no air coming in or out. And then I would say something, all of a sudden they would go, they would lean back in some cases, and then they would go, oh. And then they're having a conversation with me. I would stop them again. This is acknowledging the body. This is training the body to feel that it is not in a position where it is, the body is hopeless. It's supposed to stay hopeless. No, here's an opportunity for transforming the experience of living life. In that sense, trauma can really open up new vistas of possibilities for the person, the mind, the brain. You really will advance pretty quickly if you use trauma well for yourself to understand your life. Instead of being a captive, instead of being a prisoner, a victim to trauma. You might have been a victim then. You were helpless. I was completely helpless. My parents failed to protect me. My family failed to protect me. The walls of our house failed to protect me against those huge shrapnel that came in and chopped off pieces of my foot. My head was cracked open. Artery was like spewing blood. I was repainting the house with my blood. And sometime later, when I say sometime, I mean years later, I recalled I was trying to pull the handle of the door, it was the lock of the door, and I couldn't because my hands were slippery with blood. And I remember, look at my hands, where I was very, I was barely 2.5 feet tall, maybe 3. And I'm reaching my arms up, and it was like about 3 feet high from the ground, the handle, the lock of the door handle. And I couldn't. And I saw my dad reach overhead. He opened it, grabbed me, lifted me up. And, my body's now actually reacting. It's feeling, I can feel the goose flesh. I have to stop and acknowledge the body. And I have to remind the body that it's safe. It's not, we're talking about it, but it's a healing experience. So when I point these things out, not again in a way, what is that? Why did you breathe? That's not what we're talking about. You're not a Nazi, questioning, interrogating somebody. No. We are making the place safe. We are, as we say in the field of psychology, therapy, we're holding space, a safe space for the person to feel comfortable, especially for the body to feel relaxed enough, safe enough, trusting enough. So when I am asking the person to pause for a second to acknowledge, it's like having a family session, family therapy session, where the child is doing something, you're talking to the mom, and the child is doing something, and the mom turns and yells at the child, or the child they roll their eyes, or they all of a sudden droop their head and they're like sad. Meanwhile, they were very jovial a second ago. And I'm talking with the mom or dad. Guess what I'll do? I'll say, oh, excuse me, Tina, what happened? I changed direction. Suddenly, I made the child become the focal point. Why am I doing that? To teach the parents to pay attention to what's happening, because this is a crucial part of the puzzle, how they're treating little Tina over here. It's the same way when we're talking about the body, acknowledging the body. The body holds so many secrets. For you to harmonize and really harmonize what? The internal environment that I said, that I was referring to, where life has become stifled, life has become stuck, bundled, jumbled up into a knot. This is why a lot of people have this knot in their gut. They don't know what it is, and they feel it's an indigestion problem, or they go and take medicines, this and that, without realizing. Most of the ulcer cases are not what people say, but it's making the drug companies billions and trillions of dollars. Same thing with depression. There's healthier ways of approaching, and working with the body is key. So, do you have another question?
Yes. Think of that process of, again, befriending the body and gaining the trust, relaxing, like as you said, acknowledging its experience in the moment, noticing it. What comes to mind is the mental chatter, because how do we deal with that? Because it seems to me that that's a big hurdle.
Yes.
Allow the body to trust.
Well, in my work, when I was also working on my dissertation some years back, and I was being given patients and clients, given folders to read upon their past history and past work with other therapists. Some of them had actually been through several different therapists, have come and gone. So I've had clients who would come in and they would start saying, so now you're going to ask me this. Now you're going to ask me that. And I was like, okay, this is going to be interesting. I mean, how can you blame them? They're looking at you, because these were teenagers, by the way. They're looking at you as an unfeeling, haughty, up in the head adult who really doesn't know anything about me, and he's or she's here to pretend that they can help me. Yeah, sure. So that's generally one of the groups of people that I used to work with, as as my clientele, or as people that I was given to help. So after trying several modalities, several things that they would teach you at universities, you've read and gone to workshops, this and that training, and because I'm trained in Buddhist meditative techniques, and I had been already a meditation teacher and a meditator for many years. So I went to my supervisor at the time and I asked her, listen, all these things that you want me to play by the book, as it were, or go by the book, and they're not working. And I'm going to try what I know best to work with these clients. So I explained to her, and she was like, go for it. They haven't worked with the others. I mean, the other therapists, and the whole point is to help the patient get better. So I went and I applied a technique from the Satipatthana, but basing it on the 3 trainings. Living with virtue, which means cleansing the mind, the behavior of the body, speech, and mind. Cultivating a collectedness of mind, which we call samadhi. And wisdom, panya, which comes in the form of insights. Now, of course, you're dealing with teenagers, and many of them come from traumatic and very, in some cases, dangerous environments, neighborhoods, this and that. So they're not going to change into the virtuous lifestyle overnight. However, they have you as the model. You need to set yourself aside, or apart, rather, from other individuals that they get to see. So you need to create a breakup or an anomaly in their mind as to what adults are, especially adult therapists are like, or therapists are like, by showing humanity, by being different than those people who actually got them into this mess, into this trauma, to show them the other side of life, kindness, compassion. So here I was also doing the Brahma Viharas, loving kindness, compassion, altruistic joy, and equanimity. So sometimes they would act out, sometimes they would really try to push your buttons. So you have to show them that you can handle it while maintaining protocol, while being professional, while adhering to safety, while making sure they're in a safe environment. All these criteria have to be met in the presence of a safe environment where you're there, still giving them 100% reliable, safe place where they can trust you enough to become vulnerable. It's a long, tall list of things. But the outcome was amazing. Now, in all of this, the body was crucial for me to really get to the results I wanted, which was to reduce their symptoms from 3 to 5 times a week of outbursts, let's say, or getting in trouble in class, to 3 to 5 times a day, let's say, to dropping it down to 3 to 5 times a week. That's considerable, like from 15 times or actually more than that, 25 times 2, 3 or 5, that's a miracle for the teacher, for the family, for the patient. Because of the type of well-being that it was giving them. And they were taking charge. They were becoming more empowered in the right sense of the word, because now they were seeing that their outbursts had everything to do with them pausing a moment, reconnecting with the body, despite whatever's happening outside, that triggered them to feel threatened because the trauma kicked in. The outside thing, let's say the visual, I'll talk about this maybe in the next session more in detail, but just to give you a brief. So something they hear, something they see, that triggers part of the brain that says, oh, I need to cut loose, disconnect, disengage. The limbic system kicked in. And the body now is completely back into the trauma world. This is not working. So now they're in fight or flight or freeze mode. If they were assaulted, they couldn't do anything, they probably are going to drop into the freeze mode. Or fight or flight, depending on the situation. But all these are not what we want. So by teaching the person that they are in a safe place while we're talking about situations that are not so comfortable, at least initially, the person sees that and feels, in some cases, I would have the door open of the session room and I would sit far from them so that they would have room to run, time to run, distance to run away from me. Again, the subconscious mind, you have to consider that, not the intellect. The door, I would intentionally leave it open, and I would position the chair before they came in a way where they're ready to, they can just take off any moment. And I would tell them, give them those prompts in a way here and there. Are you comfortable? This and that. So the person, again, I'm talking about teenagers or children, to get them to feel comfortable enough to not leave the body. The adult in the room has a lot to say. Now, again, this doesn't only apply to children or teenagers. Any victim of trauma will really benefit from such a caring approach. So over time, I was like, okay, what can I do, this and that? Something simple that people could use, especially children, teenagers. And I came up with this technique I called mindful grounding, a very simple, easy to follow method that they could do any time of day. They can do it sitting, they can do standing. Initially, I thought about doing it standing posture. And they don't even have to verbally say it out loud so that other people could see. They can, because teenagers can be quite rough on each other. Bullying, teasing, and all that. Peer pressures. But the person can actually internalize this tool and still inhabit the body and benefit from that situation where they were triggered. But what they will do is they will open that window a little bit wider every single time until the moment comes where irritating triggers are happening maximally, a lot, or intensely, and they're still there. They're still aware. They still have a tool. They still are with the body, and they're watching the body. They're watching the tendencies. They're watching the breathing. They're watching the foot. They're grounding themselves in the present through the body without exiting the scene. So, and then in the case of victims of different types of trauma, I noticed, given the data that we were collecting, that even the perception that individuals had of their body, like in the case of children who were raped or sexually molested, when they were doing part of the exercise, which I had them like in the directions. By the way, I will do a separate video and also somehow have the PDF of it maybe available. And I'll actually demonstrate. It's very simple. Anyone can do. And so there's a part of it where the person touches gently their body, just like this, and they say, "This is my beautiful body." That's it. There were individual clients, while they first did this exercise, they did everything else okay, but when they got to this point, they pulled back and they stopped the exercise. They stopped the intervention. It was very interesting because we knew right then and there that this person is not only disconnected from the body during traumatic experiences or triggers that happen, but throughout the day, they don't like the body. They wear black. They don't want to see the body. They cover it up. Sometimes they're even cutting themselves. All these things come because there is a disconnect, because the body let me down, just like my parents let me down. I mean, as a child, but you have to process to understand, to gain insights that it was not in their control. It was war going on. How can a parent detect a bomb or a mortar attack when they're sitting right next to you and the shrapnels come and cut you into pieces? How are they going to defend you? But the child, the body rather, feels that the sense of security is torn. Again, this is a transformative opportunity for understanding life beyond the family nucleus, beyond the family, beyond the country, beyond the world, and to see life as an opportunity to learn our place in it and what are these occasions of transformation are really doing in improving my understanding of life and to gain wisdom, to purify myself. And this is where we're going into charting back into the Dhamma, the Buddhist arena, which we'll talk more about later. Is this good? Yes. We will continue from this point. And yeah, I'm glad this is happening because the hope is to help people. Even like if a little bit of what we're sharing here is going to help them, make me feel very good. So may you, good. So cute.